Welcome back to the channel, everyone. If you love captivating stories about men transforming into women in unique and fascinating ways, then be sure to subscribe and give this video a thumbs up. Now, let's jump right into today's tale.
Kristin sat at her desk, staring at the empty meeting room through the glass wall, her fingers lightly drumming against the sleek surface. The rhythmic tapping matched her racing heartbeat as she replayed the events of the day in her mind for what felt like the 100th time. The meeting had ended. Hours ago. Hours ago. Or, at least, it should have ended hours ago. The schedule had allotted 90 minutes, generous by industry standards for an initial consultation. More than enough time to present concepts, discuss parameters, and establish next steps. Instead, she and Daniel Carter had overshot their scheduled time by a couple of hours. So much so that their assistants had eventually left them alone, only returning to drop off coffee and snacks before excusing themselves once again with thinly veiled, knowing smiles. "Just checking if you need anything else," Jason had said during his third interruption. His expression a masterclass in professional discretion, betrayed only by the slightest twitch at the corner of his mouth. "Though it seems you two are handling things just fine." "We're making excellent progress," Daniel had replied smoothly, not even looking up from the design mock-up spread across the table between them. "Miss Thompson has been most thorough." "Very thorough," Jason had agreed, his eyes darting to Kristin with a look that promised a full interrogation later. "The refreshments are set up in the break room if you'd like anything. I'll be at my desk if you need me." He'd backed out of the room with practiced efficiency, leaving them alone. Again. And, honestly, Kristin barely even noticed. She hadn't registered Jason's departure, hadn't noticed when the sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows had shifted from morning brightness to afternoon gold. She'd been too caught up in the magnetic pull of the conversation, the verbal sparring that had evolved from professional discussion to something far more personal and intriguing. "So tell me," Daniel had asked as they lingered over coffee and the artisanal pastries Jason had arranged. "How does someone with your obvious talent end up specializing in corporate spaces rather than residential design? Most creative types prefer the freedom of private homes." "Most creative types don't have my business sense," Kristin had replied, surprised by her own confidence. "Residential clients change their minds constantly, argue about every detail, and generally make the process twice as long for half the profit. Corporate clients have deadlines, budgets, and board approvals, constraints that actually force more creative solutions." Daniel had laughed, a genuine sound that crinkled the corners of his eyes in a way that did ridiculous things to her pulse rate. "Practical and talented. A dangerous combination." "I prefer to think of it as efficient," she'd countered, taking a sip of her coffee to hide the smile his compliment had triggered. "Why spend months coddling a homeowner through endless revisions when I could be transforming entire office complexes?" "Fair point," Daniel had conceded. "Though I hope you won't find me too demanding as a client." The way he'd said demanding had carried just enough suggestion to make her cheeks warm. "Ah, again. I suspect you know exactly what you want," she'd replied before she could censor herself. "That does make my job easier, usually." His smile had deepened, those blue eyes never leaving hers. "I do know what I want. The challenge is finding someone who can deliver it." Because the meeting. It had stopped being a meeting a long time ago. Somewhere between discussing material samples and comparing their fantasy football rosters, the professional consultation had morphed into something else entirely. The air between them had grown charged with unspoken possibilities, with glances that lingered too long, with accidental brushes of fingers as they both reached for the same document. "You mentioned earlier that your linebacker is struggling with an injury," Daniel had said during their extended football discussion. "Williams, right, from Denver." "Yes." Kristin had replied, genuinely surprised. How did you know? Daniel's smile had been enigmatic. I pay attention to details, especially when they involve potential rivals. Stalking my fantasy team, Mr. Carter, she teased, leaning forward slightly. I'm flattered by the attention, but it won't help you. I've already lined up his replacement. Smart move, he'd acknowledged with an appreciative nod. Though I'd expect nothing less from you at this point. The conversation had flowed so naturally, so easily, that Kristin had almost forgotten the bizarre circumstances that had brought her to this moment. For those hours she hadn't been Kyle trapped in Kristin's body. She'd just been Kristin Thompson, successful designer, holding her own with an attractive, intelligent man who seemed genuinely interested in everything she had to say. Now, alone in her office, with only the memory of that charged interaction, Kristin found herself in a state of confused exhilaration. The drumming of her fingers increased tempo as she attempted to process what had happened, and more alarmingly, how she had felt about it. What am I doing? She whispered to the empty office, her reflection in the glass wall offering no answers. This is not who I am. This is not what I do. Except it was, apparently. Kristin Thompson flirted with handsome clients. Kristin Thompson held her own in discussions about football, while looking impeccable in 4-inch heels. Kristin Thompson made competitive banter sound like foreplay, without even trying. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her spiraling thoughts. With a slightly unsteady hand, she reached for it, expecting a message from Jason, or perhaps one of her design team with questions about tomorrow's project. Instead, the screen displayed a number she didn't recognize, accompanying a text message that made her breath catch. Dinner tomorrow, to discuss the project further, of course. I know a place that serves excellent bourbon and has the game on. Kristin stared at the message, her heart performing gymnastics in her chest. How had he gotten her personal number? Though the answer was obvious, Jason, the traitor, had undoubtedly provided it with gleeful efficiency. Her thumbs hovered over the screen, uncertainty battling with an inexplicable excitement. The Kyle part of her brain was frantically waving red flags, pointing out all the reasons this was a terrible idea. She was still adjusting to being Kristin. She had no idea how to date as a woman. This was a client. For God's sake. But the Kristin part, the part that had taken over so effortlessly during their meeting, was already composing a reply, the words forming without conscious effort. Bourbon and football. You certainly know how to tempt a girl. 7 p.m. Kristin. She hit send before she could overthink it, then immediately placed the phone face down on her desk, as if it might explode. What am I doing? She repeated, this time with more panic in her voice. This is insane. Her phone buzzed again. Despite her better judgment, she flipped it over instantly. 7 p.m. it is. I'll send a car. Looking forward to continuing our rivalry in person. Kristin set the phone down again, her mind racing. She had just agreed to what was unmistakably a date with Daniel Carter, tech entrepreneur, potential client, and apparently the first man to make her newly female body respond with embarrassing enthusiasm. Gran, she muttered, thoughts turning to her grandmother's smug predictions about her luck. If this is your idea of things working out, we need to have a serious conversation about your definition of success. But despite her protests, despite the alarm bells ringing in the Kyle corner of her mind, despite the sheer absurdity of the situation, she couldn't deny the flutter of anticipation in her stomach at the thought of seeing Daniel again. And that, perhaps, was the most disturbing realization of all. Kristin swiveled in her office chair, the premium Italian leather creaking softly as she turned to gaze out the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city sprawled below her, a concrete jungle bathed in late-afternoon sunlight, but she barely registered the view. Her mind was elsewhere, replaying every moment of the meeting like a highlight reel she couldn't shut off. At first they had kept things business-focused, going over the design aspects, branding ideas, and marketing strategies. Professional. Proper. Just two executives discussing a potential multi-million-dollar partnership. The integration of natural elements with a tech-forward aesthetic creates a compelling contradiction, Daniel had observed, his fingers trailing over the material samples she'd presented. It's unexpected. I like that. Most tech spaces feel cold, sterile, Kristin had explained, surprised by how easily the design philosophy flowed from her lips. We want quantum innovations to feel human. Approachable innovation rather than intimidating advancement. Approachable innovation, Daniel had repeated, nodding thoughtfully. That's exactly what we're trying to build. You've captured the essence of our brand philosophy in just 2 words. But as the minutes stretched on, the conversation had shifted. Almost imperceptibly at first, a lingering glance here, a slightly personal question there, until they were discussing favorite restaurants, travel destinations, and the merits of bourbon versus scotch. Single malt, aged at least 15 years, Daniel had declared with mock seriousness. Anything else is just expensive water. Bourbon has more character, Kristin had countered, surprising herself with the confident opinion. Scotch is what men drink when they want to look sophisticated, but are afraid of actual flavor. Daniel's laugh had been rich and genuine. Fighting words, Miss Thompson? I'll have to prove you wrong sometime. The flirting had been relentless. Sometimes subtle, sometimes blatantly obvious. The way he leaned forward when she spoke, giving her his complete attention. The way his voice dropped half an octave when making suggestions that could be interpreted in multiple ways. I believe in exploring all possibilities before making a commitment, he'd said at one point, ostensibly discussing design options. Don't you agree it's important to experiment before settling? And the banter. God, the banter had been good. Your team is in for a rough season, Daniel had teased when their conversation turned back to football. Your quarterback's completion rate drops by 15% when playing outdoors in cold weather. You've done your homework, Kristin had replied, impressed despite herself. But statistics only tell part of the story. My quarterback has the best fourth-quarter comeback record in the league. He performs when it matters. Finishing strong is important, Daniel had agreed, his eyes never leaving hers. Though consistency throughout has its merits as well. Daniel was sharp-witted, charming, and just the right amount of cocky. He carried himself with the confidence of a man who knew his worth without needing to prove it. And that, annoyingly, was incredibly attractive. I once fired a supplier for being 15 minutes late to a meeting, he'd admitted during one of their tangents. Not because of the 15 minutes, but because when I called him on it, he gave me 15 different excuses instead of one genuine apology. Harsh but fair, Kristin had responded, finding herself nodding in agreement. Nothing worse than someone who can't own their mistakes. Exactly, Daniel had said, looking pleasantly surprised by her understanding. Most people think I'm unreasonable when I tell that story. Most people waste time making excuses instead of fixing problems, she'd replied, the words coming naturally despite Kyle's historically more lenient approach to punctuality. And to her complete shock, Kristin had been keeping up, effortlessly. Each quip, each flirtatious comment, each subtle challenge, she'd met them all with a confidence that felt simultaneously foreign and utterly natural. She wasn't just flirting back, she was enjoying it. The verbal sparring, the intellectual dance, the charged undercurrent that made even discussions about material durability somehow feel suggestive. So you're saying this surface can withstand significant pressure? Daniel had asked, running his fingers along a sample of specialized countertop material. Absolutely, Kristin had replied, meeting his gaze directly. It's designed to endure intense use without showing wear. The harder the environment, the better it performs. The double entendres had flown back and forth across the table, until Jason, returning with fresh coffee, had nearly spilled the entire tray. And then there was the invitation. After their fourth tangent into fantasy, football strategies, and team rivalries, Daniel had leaned back in his chair, loosening his tie just enough to make Kristin's mouth go inexplicably dry. She could still hear his voice in that smooth, low baritone. "You know, Kristin, I'd love to see how you react to a real game. How about we watch the game together this Saturday? I know a great bar with the best seats in town." The invitation had been casual yet direct, professional yet personal, perfectly calibrated to give her an easy out if she wanted to decline, while making it clear he was hoping she wouldn't. She had blushed, and not the small, subtle kind of blush. No, she had flushed hard, her body betraying her yet again. Heat had rushed to her face so intensely she could feel it burning down her neck, probably turning her skin the same shade as her hair. "Miss Thompson," Daniel had observed with evident delight, "I do believe you're blushing." "It's the lighting in here," she'd replied automatically, which had only made him laugh. "If that were true, I'd hire your lighting designer immediately." That's quite an effect. And instead of dodging the question, she had flirted right back, teasing him about whether this was his way of asking her on a date. "Is that what this is, Mr. Carter?" she'd asked, arching one perfectly shaped eyebrow. "Are you using football as a pretext to spend time with me outside of business hours?" His grin in response had been devastating. Not the polite professional smile he'd worn when first entering her office, but something more genuine, more wolfish, a smile that transformed his already handsome face into something that should have carried a warning label. "I prefer to think of it as finding multiple avenues of compatibility," he'd replied, his blue eyes dancing with amusement. "Business, football, bourbon, who knows what other interests we might share?" The suggestion in his tone had been impossible to miss, hanging in the air between them like a tangible thing. "Subtle," Kristin had remarked dryly, though her racing heart had belied her composed exterior. "I can be subtle when the situation calls for it," Daniel had replied with a shrug. "But I find directness more efficient." I enjoy your company, Kristin. I'd like to enjoy it in a setting where we're not surrounded by material samples and project timelines." His honesty had been disarming. No games, no pretense, just straightforward interest. Kyle had never been on the receiving end of such direct pursuit, had always been the one doing the chasing, often awkwardly, and with mixed results. Saturday, she'd heard herself saying, the word emerging before she'd fully processed her decision. "But not a bar. I have a better idea." Daniel's eyebrows had risen in interest. "I'm intrigued. My apartment has a projection system that makes the players look life-sized," she'd explained, immediately wondering why on earth she was inviting this man to her home. "And I make buffalo wings that would put any sports bar to shame." Home field advantage, Daniel had noted with that damnable half-smile. "Clever strategy, Ms. Thompson." "Just evening the playing field," she'd countered. "Unless you're intimidated by a woman who knows her way around both a kitchen and a fantasy football lineup." "On the contrary," he'd replied, his voice dropping to that dangerous lower register again. "I find it incredibly appealing." They'd exchanged numbers, or rather he'd somehow already had, which raised questions about how thoroughly he'd researched her before their meeting, and confirmed the time. Just like that, she'd gone from professional consultation to hosting Daniel Carter in her home for what was unmistakably a date, regardless of whatever football-related pretense they were maintaining. Now alone in her office, with only her whirling thoughts for company, Kristin couldn't decide if she'd made a brilliant move or a catastrophic mistake. The Kyle part of her brain was in full panic mode, a jumble of conflicting reactions to finding a man attractive, let alone inviting him to her home. But the Kristin part, the part that seemed to be growing stronger with each passing hour, was already planning what to wear, anticipating the challenge of impressing a man who was clearly used to being the most impressive person in any room. "What have I gotten myself into?" she murmured, turning back to her desk. Her phone chimed with a new message. Daniel again. Looking forward to Saturday. Fair warning. I take both my football and my buffalo wings very seriously. A smile tugged at her lips despite herself. The man was relentless. "As do I," she typed back. "Prepare to be impressed on both counts." She set the phone down, her mind already racing ahead to Saturday. What would she wear? How would her apartment look to his discerning eyes? Would she be able to maintain this confident, flirtatious persona when they were alone, without the buffer of a professional setting? Most concerning of all, why was she looking forward to it with such embarrassing enthusiasm? "This is insane," she told her empty office. Absolutely insane. But insane or not, she couldn't deny the flutter of anticipation that rose in her chest every time she thought of those blue eyes, that devastating smile, and the charged conversation that had made hours feel like minutes. Saturday couldn't come soon enough.